Many thousands of years ago, during the War of Vengeance, the Dwarfs of the Karazankor and the Elves of the Phoenix Throne were locked in a bitter struggle, one that would come to severely weaken both races. This was a time when the Ulthwani still had colonies in the Old World, many of which were closely linked to a magical forest called Athel Loren. When the Dwarfs pushed westwards, in their quest to drive the Elves back to their island fortress, they cut down huge swaths of timber, slaughtering spirits that had laid dormant for centuries. In response, Durthu Oakheart opened pathways for the vengeful Dwarfs, leading them directly into elven colonies who responded with utter brutality in defense of their homeland. But unable to contend with the full might of the Dwarf Empire now moving westwards, now independent and cut off from the Phoenix Throne, their only hope of survival was to move deeper into Athel Loren, forming a symbiotic relationship with the forest itself. From that point on, bitter hatred existed between the Dwarfs and the Wood Elves, and that rivalry managed to carry itself all the way over to Total War Warhammer 2's multiplayer component as well. But for the longest time, it's been a rather one-sided matchup. The Dwarfs have traditionally ruled this in multiplayer, utilizing a combination of cheap, heavily armored, shielded warriors, with cost-efficient skirmish play, powerful artillery, runes, and magic resistance, which pretty much just hard-countered the vast majority of what the Wood Elves would try and do. And I think the reason I found this matchup so fascinating for so long is how terrible it's been for so long. How unique and how diametrically opposed these factions are, and how that asymmetry led to some of the worst, most tedious gameplay imaginable. I'm talking 20-plus minute games where Waywatchers slowly shoot all their ammo into a brick wall phalanx. Just not very entertaining. I did a full breakdown for why I think it was the worst rivalry in the game in my top 5 worst matchups in Warhammer 2 video from a while back, so if you want to take a look at what it used to be like, you should go check that out. But I wanted to figure out what the Dwarfs vs. Wood Elves matchup is like now, after the Twist and Twilight dropped and completely changed the game for the Wood Elves. And big shocker here, once the Azrai got their new DLC, they immediately became one of the strongest factions in the game. Never seen anything like that before, except for, basically every other faction or Lord Pack content drop we've gotten since launch day. Basically, if you get a DLC, there's like a 90% chance you'll be a top tier faction as soon as that patch goes live. And sure enough, most high-level competitive players think the Wood Elves are S tier at the moment, in the upper bracket of the strongest factions in multiplayer currently. So, before we take a deep dive into the Wood Elves vs. Dwarfs matchup in 2021, and watch as a high-level Azrai player in Felkon takes on a high-level Dwarfs player in Eumaies in a 10-game series, let's do a quick overview of where each race stands in the grand scheme of things. Now for the Dawi, the stunty grudge gnomes of Karazakarak are nowhere near as bad or helpless as YouTube comments would have you believe. They have been quite a competent and reasonably competitive faction for a very long time, but like I've said before, they are a race of extremes, and they have some clear-cut strengths and weaknesses. They have some of the very best and most lopsided matchups in the game that tend to play out in their favor, and they also have a few of the very worst. The High Elves and Skaven have historically been abysmal matchups for the Dwarfs of the Karazankor, and I don't really see that changing anytime soon. Chaos, Dark Elves, factions with hard-hitting chariots and infantry choices that can crump their front line tend to give them serious trouble. Although, I will say that the mass nerfs to chariots and cavalry has made it easier for the Dawi to stand their ground and perform well in some traditionally bad matchups. On the flip side, though, the Dwarfs tend to stomp the Vampire Coast, the Empire, and in days of yore, the Wood Elves, which is the main thing we'll be looking at today, whether that theme still holds true. By the way, in case it's not obvious, these tier lists are not meant to be a perfect representation of how their matchups currently stand. They're just meant to give you a general idea of which ones are good for them, which ones are bad, and which ones happen to be the best and worst. So the Dwarfs, I would say, are currently a solid B-tier faction. They are certainly not in that upper echelon, but they have a good chance against a large chunk of the cast, and completely dominate a few very good factions in the Vampire Coast and the Empire of Man. Now, on the other hand, the Wood Elves are absolutely an S-tier faction right now. They are extremely good. Their rush game completely opened up with the addition of cheap light cavalry, of vanguard options for many of their lords. They got a bunch of new units and buffs to old ones, and a much better, more viable selection of legendary lords to choose from. Lords who made an immediate impact straight from day one. They still have some bad matchups. Stone Trolls and Vindictive Glare still make the Wood Elves very sad, and of course the Greenskins are a very strong faction currently, also probably in S tier. Bretonnia is no longer a completely horrendous matchup for the Wood Elves with the addition of Zotes and Durthu plus aerial blobs, but I still think it can be pretty hard for them. so I'd say it's like high D tier or low C tier. The High Elves used to be a horrible matchup for the Wood Elves, because Dragon Princes and Silver Helms would just run all over you, but now it's pretty even. The addition of the Wild Rider ROR was actually a big change, and then, of course, with the Twist and the Twilight, got even better for the Wood Elves, and at a high level, they completely dumpster the Vampire Counts and the Dark Elves. Essentially, most of the stuff that gave the Azrai massive problems before the Twisted and the Twilight dropped doesn't anymore. So when it comes to Dwarfs versus Wood Elves, the way this rivalry used to go, before the newest DLC, was that the Dwarfs would rely on a handful of auto-win builds and ideas with minimal micromanagement. The Wood Elves are, of course, a very squishy faction. They can't really afford to sit there and trade in a skirmish duel, so the Dwarfs would build an 18 stack with a lot of shielded crossbows, lots of blasting charge miners and cheap infantry, a Rune Lord for Rune of Wrath and Ruin, and even higher magic and missile resist, and 2 organ guns to force the Wood Elves into the fire arc of Rangers and Quarrelers. The thing about organ guns is that each of their projectiles has enough damage to one-shot any infantry model the Wood Elves can field, so they generate insane amounts of value in very short order simply by shooting stuff, whether it be archers or the melee rush that's incoming their direction. And they directly force the Wood Elves to enter the fire arc of those troops. Sitting back with Waystalkers and Arrow of Kernusing their artillery wasn't super viable, because the Rune Lord would just park himself on the organ guns and give them damage resist every single time a magic missile came forward, so the cannons wouldn't blow up when the Arrow of Kernus made contact. So you'd have these very long stalemates where both armies just kind of stared at each other, and eventually when it came down to a war of attrition, if the Waywatchers didn't kill enough important stuff, the Azrai would just die in melee at the end of a super boring 20-minute game. And that's the thing. In days past, the Wood Elves couldn't really rush. They only had one viable avenue to compete, which was to kite, which was to spam Waywatchers, sit back, and just shoot all day, and hope by the end of the game you've done enough damage that you can win in melee combat. Their Lord choices were terrible in this matchup. They had no cheap light cav, their infantry traded poorly into blasting charges, blah 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 blah. Lots of stuff was going wrong for them there. So what we wanted to figure out was, is there a single dwarf build that can still dominate or at least perform well against the majority of what the Wood Elves can throw at them? Because that used to be the case. It's a big reason why this matchup sucked to play and watch. So that's one thing we're going to try to figure out in this video. Now, another thing everyone should be aware of when it comes to the Azrai right now is that they are a much more versatile faction than they used to be. They can blob, they can kite, they can build very balanced armies, and most importantly, they can rush, and rush extremely well. They have a variety of playstyles open to them now, while the Dwarfs tend to be much more set in their ways, finding a middle ground between countering rush builds and countering kite builds. Let's take a look at some of the new additions to the Wood Elves roster and discuss whether they could be useful here. Well, War Dancers and Wildwood Rangers are both solid choices. Both are extremely susceptible to blasting charges, of course, but they tend to trade pretty well into dwarf infantry. Dances got buffed, so you have a bit of extra utility when it comes to how you engage with War Dancers, and neither are prohibitively expensive, so you can afford to take a decent amount of them in your rush armies. Blade Dancers, on the other hand, are a trap in this matchup. They have fantastic armor-piercing potential. I'm sure most of you guys have seen Zerkovich's video where they're beating Chosen Great Weapons mano-a-mano, but they do basically the exact same thing War Dancers do at a much steeper price. And of course, their magic attacks don't exactly help things. They're losing a lot of their damage output simply because of that innate magic resist amongst the dwarfs. Glade Riders were a huge boon for the Wood Elves. They aren't an amazing unit in and of themselves, but having a cheap cavalry option that can tie down crossbows, harass the back line, and generally be annoying was a pretty big game changer for the Wood Elves. They basically open up avenues of attack for everything else on their roster. Now, Great Stag Knights are a really interesting unit. They rarely pay for themselves up front, but that's one element where I think damage value doesn't really tell the whole story. It's important to note that just because you didn't get great damage value out of a unit on that endgame stat screen doesn't mean your unit was useless or that it didn't truly pay for itself. But I'm going to disagree with Felkon here and say that they are an okay choice. They are far from a go-to pick, and they have a very high micro attacks while performing a very similar role to Wild Riders. They are certainly a risky investment, but they can also outright win you battles. I would not rely on them overly much, but they can be a solid surprise pick in a Vanguard rush. With that said, Wild Riders will often perform similarly at a much cheaper price point. They just don't have quite the same potential to crack a game wide open if you catch an opponent off guard. That's why Felkon doesn't truly love the unit in this matchup. He thinks they're kind of a trap. I'd say they can be a trap, but overall I think they're okay here. But the Lost Sylvan Knights, the ROR Great Stag unit, is a complete and total beast against the Dwarfs, and it's not for the reason you might think. Yes, they have magical attacks, which are less than ideal here, but you aren't picking them for incredible damage, you're picking them for incredible tankiness. Unlike basically every other Monstrous Cavalry unit in the game, this unit is absurdly resilient against non-magical sources, which of course the Dwarfs don't have a lot of access to magic damage. They don't have many good tools for killing Spectral Stags efficiently, so where regular Great Stag Knights would get pounded into paste, the Lost Sylvan Knights can get hyper-aggressive and tie up entire flanks while tanking range damage for minutes at a time. And even if they get mismicroed, they will survive and keep on trucking unless you really blunder them heavily. Dwarf players must keep in mind that the Lost Sylvan Knights exist, or they can lose to them. Now, as we said previously, Wood Elf Lords used to be terrible choices. Durthu and Orion just didn't cut it. They'd get wrecked by Slayers, Focus Fire, Artillery, basically everything. But all that changed with the Twisted and the Twilight. Nystra and Arahan are a hard counter to artillery. Their Eagle's Quiver and Single Shot will absolutely wreck organ guns, and perhaps more importantly, they have the ability to just sit there above a Dwarf army and shoot them, because when they're on Gwendolore, crossbow fire is pretty ineffective at hurting them, and like all Eagles and Hawks, they do that Matrix dodge animation when they get shot. And they have Conjoy and Destiny, so even if you manage to get them very low, they'll get about 1800 HP back and be right back in the fight. So Sisters are very good here, especially with a kite build or one that relies on Waywatcher firepower. But if you want to rush, then Drycha is the way to go. She is a very good lord against the Dwarfs. She has Vanguard options and a low profile, so she can't be sniped out easily, and she has Dryad summons, which the Dwarfs can't run away from, really. So you're pretty much always getting max value there, because you can just orbital drop them on Slayers or Crossbows or Artillery, Dryads appearing in the Dwarf rear, and suddenly those units are completely shut down and will be for a while, which opens up avenues of attack for your other troops. So now that you guys have an in-depth picture of this matchup, a basic overview of it, let's see how it plays out on the battlefield, and then we'll draw some conclusions about how things stand in the year of our Lord 2021. RTK Eumaies will represent the Dwarf delegation here. He is an accomplished Dwarf player with a lot of experience on that front, and the mighty Felkon himself will represent the Wood Elves until about 2/3 of the way through this 10-game series, when they will switch factions and start playing it from the other side. Now, I will have to make some cuts and do a lot of speeding up, because otherwise this video will be like 2 hours long. We're talking about a 10-game series here, so we will be watching a lot of these battles in fast forward, but it should still give you a good idea of the types of builds veteran players rely on, and I'll explain some of their unit choices and decision making and how those can win or lose you games. So the first thing to note is map selection. Small maps with a lot of Vanguard areas and deployment very close together tend to favor the Wood Elves. They want to get in your face in a hurry. Rushing is very common for the Az right now. Big open maps with deployments far apart tend to favor the Dwarfs. So in this first game, Felkon selected Estalian Tomb, which is known for having scrunched up deployments that are super close to one another, which means he can get very aggressive and shut down the Dwarf ranged firepower pretty quickly. And almost immediately, he compromises the back line with a combination of Drycha, Pendulums, and Glade Riders, and it all ends rather quickly with a decisive multi-pronged attack. After this game, I told both players not to concede early, just so we can have a bit more time to discuss and analyze what happened, but that was the first game of the day, just a warm-up. Wouldn't read too much into it, but still, it was a great showcase for Drycha and why she's such a strong pick here. She didn't really have to do a whole lot. She Vanguard deployed behind enemy lines, used Rouse to Wrath to summon Dryads on the crossbows, and immediately tied up the biggest threats to his rush. Well played from Felkon there. Now on to the second game, and we have a Master Engineer making an appearance to face off against the Sisters of Twilight and the Lost Sylvan Knights with a Waywatcher core. This is a very different style of play from the Wood Elves here, shifting from a pure rush army with a little bit of skirmish support to full-on keep away with the Sisters of Twilight. Now, organ guns would generally be very good against this type of Wood Elf build. It would force the Azrai to enter the fire arc of the crossbows while their Weight Watchers get blown apart by artillery fire, but the Sisters of Twilight kind of make that a risky proposition. They can kill artillery very easily, and if you go for an artillery type build, you open yourself up to being overrun by a vanguard rush with heavy cav, a type of army the double organ gun is typically pretty susceptible to. Now watch as Felkon uses those Great Stag Knights, the Lost Sylvan Knights. He is getting incredibly aggressive with them, basically using them by themselves, shock and awe tactics, just going into the teeth of the Dwarf army, cyclo-charging all day long. And yes, they've taken some damage, but with a regrowth or any kind of heal you want to send their way, they're going to get tons of value out of that. And all the while, the Sisters are sitting above, shooting into the infantry, killing off Quarrelers, killing off Bugman's Rangers, and dealing a lot of damage. So the fact that those Great Stag Knights, those Lost Sylvan Knights, can operate unto themselves while cyclo-charging the Dwarfs, well, it gives you a lot of opportunity to just sit there with the Weight Watchers and cause havoc. All of them earning chevrons. Lost Sylvan Knights, 151 kills, almost 2,000 damage value. Sisters, 2,400 damage value, and they did a lot to shut down what the Dwarfs wanted to do in this one. And I think it's a perfect example of how Lost Sylvan Knights play. They aren't really focused on dealing tremendous amounts of damage. Sure, they got a lot of kills there, but it wasn't about their DPS. It was about how tanky they were in the face of all that Dwarf firepower. Now, this one is interesting in the third game because Eumaies has gone for a double engineer build. And this is how you want to counter these Sisters of Twilight. Now, unfortunately, the Sisters did not show up in this particular battle. Felkon has gone for a Spellweaver of the Lore of Beasts with Amber Spear and Transformation of Kadon Eagle Summons. Now, Amber Spear is a very interesting spell. It can kill half an Ironbreaker unit in a single overcast if you manage to hit the right angle from the flank. And Felkon has gone for a lot of Archer firepower, which Eumaies is doing a good job shutting down with his Slayers as they push through. Starfire Shafts and regular Glade Guard firing in, while the Spellweaver sets up on the flanks and tries to get some great Amber Spears in alongside those Eagle Summons, which have gotten in and atop the Bugman's Rangers. Now, Bugman's Rangers are a great unit in this particular matchup because they have regen, they can outtrade most Wood Elf archers, except for Weight Watchers, of course, and they have charge defense against large. So if you're charging them with Glade Riders or that kind of unit, even Wild Riders, Great Stags, that kind of thing, they will take that charge, they will use that regen, and they will survive the initial impact. Double Engineer is the counter to the Sisters of Twilight because, you know, that Shudder animation whenever the Gwendolord takes some damage and he'll kind of start dodging all the Quarreler shots, well, that won't work against Double Master Engineer play. The projectiles are too fast and they do too much damage. She can't sit on top of those two and just trade because she will lose that very badly. They do too much damage. But you don't bring them just to counter the Sisters. They're essentially artillery that can't be shut down in the same way that artillery can. Their rifles can kill high-value models, like Great Stags. They can even deal some good damage to Lost Sylvan Knights given enough time, and they can snipe out the high-value single entities, like a Spellweaver or Waystalkers. So very well played from Eumaies there. The Engineers put in a ton of work. Slayers managed to get into the Archers and shut all of them down, and it just ended up being a grinded out war of attrition, which typically favors the Dawi in these kind of scenarios. Gromradal is a good choice here with the Flash Bomb and the magical attacks. You can actually ward off the Lost Sylvan Knights pretty well. He is a counter to them in some capacity, but he's also very expensive. He's better than he was before. He's now unbreakable, which kind of stepped on Ungrim's toes. I'm not sure I agree with that choice, but Gromradal is a beast in this matchup. He just makes it harder to go really wide, which is typically what you'll see against the Wood Elves. Now, this is kind of the more traditional style of play that the Dwarfs would typically rely on in this particular matchup. They're going for a Rune Lord and 2 Organ Guns. And considering that Felkon has gone for a kite style of play, that's typically going to be the dream scenario if you're the Dwarfs. But watch how Felkon goes in, tanks all that damage, and doesn't really care about it too much. Sure, the Sisters are dropping low, but he knows Conjoy and Destiny will get them back up to mostly full HP, so he can afford to sit in the pocket and trade, and he's already killed off 2 of the organ guns, while his archers have taken minimal damage up to this point. Only 1 unit has been damaged against all those quarrelers and rangers. So now, Sisters continue to go in. Conjoined Destiny has popped. She's continuing to skirmish. She's doing a lot of damage here. Gone into melee, trying to shut down some of this ranger play. But big micro mistake. She had so much ammunition left, and Felkon knew what kind of mistake that was. No reason to go into melee with her at that point. Master Rune of Wrath and Ruin will slow her, and she will die. If he had not sent her into melee there, she could have used a lot more ammo, done a lot more damage, gotten rid of the organ guns, gotten rid of more rangers, and probably would have been in a pretty decent spot to take that battle. Unfortunately, he made a slight micro mistake, and Eumaies is going to do a great job of capitalizing on it. See her off the map, she's shattered, and now it's more of an uphill battle for the Azrite. With a full skirmish build, he can still spread the field, still has a lot of ammunition, but stuff is going to be a lot harder moving forward without that support, without that ability to maybe goon out the Rune Lord in a late game scenario. Weight Watchers still have a little bit of ammunition. Slayers are fully surrounded, and they won't even perform that well against Glade Guard in melee, especially not when they're backed up by Waystalkers. They just take so much damage. They can get lots of kills, but they'll also take damage, and looks like the Slayers lost that fight. Rune Lord surrounded, and now it is over. Even with the Sisters' micro mistake, Felkon's going to be able to take Game 4 with a full-on kite build, and the organ guns really didn't do that much. Sisters proving their worth in their ability to shut down artillery play. Very impressive to see that. And the Waystalker, just a nice choice because it can snipe out artillery with Arrow of Kurnus. So I don't know if he was expecting artillery in this one, but it worked out that way. He can also deal some good damage to Rune Lords over time, just kind of whittle them down, chunk them down, and of course firing into Slayers, going into melee. Just a good, versatile pick that can impact the battle in a multitude of ways. Also important to remember that Felkon is quite literally one of the best players in the world, in my opinion, and the opinion of many other top-level competitive guys. So he will be able to pull out some scenarios that a normal competitive player or a high-level competitive player might necessarily not be able to all the time. Felkon's just very damn good at the game, so that will skew the results a little bit here. Eumaies has done well so far. This one, not going to go so hot for the Dwarfs. Great Stag Knights and the Lost Sylvan Knights immediately into the back line, and this is actually why Felkon prefers Wild Riders, because you can bring pretty much 3 of them for the price of 2 Great Stag Knights. With that said, Great Stag Knights have some more punching power against the Dawi. They have more charge, they have more armor-piercing potential, and they're going to do a lot of work in this one. Absolutely running over the rear lines, getting into the organ guns, and this wasn't really about micro. This was a pure counter pick from the word go. Like I said at the start of this video, double organ gun, not the play if your opponent has gone for a full heavy cav vanguard rush type build. You can see they just didn't have enough to protect the rear. Great Stags had their way, slaughtered everything, and this one's going to end up being very lopsided and end very quickly. So that is one of the biggest dynamic changes we've seen since the Twisted and Twilight in this matchup. Organ guns used to be pretty much auto-include. Now they are still quite good if they're used against a kite build, but if a rush build comes out with a lot of heavy cav, they are very susceptible to that. And of course, with the Sisters flying overhead, there's a big threat there. So there's a lot of counterplay, a lot of back and forth here. You can go double Master Engineer to try to counter the Sisters. You can try to go double Organ Gun to counter the Kite. Wood Elves can do a lot to counter those counters. It gets pretty crazy. There's a lot of mind games. It's why I think this matchup is a lot more fun now. More about that when we get into the conclusion of this video. But Felkon is now playing the Dwarf side of this particular matchup. We've gone for a full rush build for the Wood Elves. Full surround off here. Wildwood Rangers, of course, really the only matchup they see play is against the Dawi. They're really not used for much else, which is unfortunate because they're a pretty cool unit. He's done a good job getting into the rear, a full surround off, but in a war of attrition, with Felkon having the high ground and a lot of Bugman's Rangers, they were able to weather the storm initially. He's managed to rout off Well, he has a full surround off on Drycha now. There's a full surround off on the Eternal Guard. Dwarfs have turned this one on its head, and they are going to barely be able to eke this one out with a lot of help from the Dragonback Slayers. Drycha cloven in two, and I think that battle demonstrates just how tanky Quarrelers and especially Bugman's Rangers are. I mean, they went up against a full melee rush build. Wildwood Rangers, War Dancers, Eternal Guard, and a lot of them. It is a lot of armor-piercing potential going their way, and they held firm, all of them, getting good kills, and the Azrai just don't hold up well when there's a lot of focus fire going their way. So you can see why shielded, high leadership, high armor troops that are cheap and cost efficient can kind of cause the Wood Elves a lot of fits. Now, Eumaies is going for a similar type build in this one. In fact, I think it might be the exact same army. He wanted another go at it. I think it's the same army for both sides, and he's going to spread the field even more in this one. Try to get that full surround off, try to outposition Felkon, try to get in and amongst those Bugman's Rangers and get a little bit more armor-piercing damage going their way early. War Dancers so good out on the flanks. Now when they're losing combat, they can toggle to a new dance to get plus 24 melee defense and help them survive a lot longer than they used to be able to do. War Dancers are just a more viable, versatile unit at this point because of the rework to how dances happen. Another Roused Wrath, that Dryad summon. So good, managing to tie down 2 full units of Bugman's Rangers and Quarrelers, and that is a game-changing spell, preventing them from firing in on the low armor troops of the Azrai battle line for quite a long time. Drycha's in the thick of it now, slaughtering off all these Rangers, and the Wood Elves have done a great job in this one. Eumaies has done a great job in this one, and it looks like, barring some kind of miracle on Felkon's side, the Wood Elves are going to be able to take this one. Rune Lord in a precarious position, and the axe will fall. He will die. That will be your game. Now, I know we talked about Great Stags being a nice surprise pick for the Wood Elves in a full Vanguard rush. Gyrocopters are kind of that sneaky unit you can bring if you're the Dawi that can really help clean up a Wood Elves rush if you're expecting one. If you bring 3 or 4 gyrocopter units and your opponent isn't prepared for it, but has a rush-centric army like the one Eumaies brought in this battle, and they have a lot of melee troops, the Wood Elves can be in huge trouble. So it's a pick Wood Elves players must respect and game plan for, because gyrocopters can mess them up bad, especially the steam gun ones, if they are not prepared for them. Okay, so this is the final battle from their 10-game series, and this time Felkon has gone for a very elite army. Now, 3 Ironbreakers, actually quite good against a Wood Elves rush. If they went full kite and they went full Waywatcher spam, that's a huge problem. Ironbreakers will not fare well under those conditions. The Waywatchers will get insane value. They'll crush them. They'll kill them from range. That'll be GG pretty much from the word go. But if you're expecting a rush build, and to be fair, we've seen more rushes from the Wood Elves than we have seen full kite builds, then I think that's a scenario where the Ironbreakers can really shine. And it seems a little bit counterintuitive, because Ironbreakers are obviously very expensive, and they are susceptible to armor piercing, which the Azrai have in spades, but it worked out perfectly here. Obviously not a build you want to rely on all the time, because again, if they go a lot of Waywatchers, Waystalkers, Sisters of Twilight, and sit back and just shoot you, there's nothing they can do. You'll be losing expensive infantry that just won't get you any value whatsoever. But the Ironbreakers, not only can they deal tremendous damage with their blasting charges, but they can hold out super well against Wildwood Rangers, against War Dancers. They can get some great value for you, and the Ironbreakers pretty much won Felkon this game and completely caught Eumaies off guard. So after we played all those games, we sat down and discussed the Dwarfs versus Wood Elves matchup, what we think about it, what we thought about what we saw, what we thought about unit selections and army compositions that are viable, not viable, that sort of thing. And we came to some fairly straightforward conclusions. Even though the Wood Elves won more games in this scenario, in this best of 10 series, I think that the Dwarfs, and Felkon thinks, and Eumaies thinks, that the Dwarfs are still favored in this matchup. But what was maybe like a 7-3 kind of scenario where the Dwarfs would win 7 out of 10 games. Maybe that's not fully accurate, but it felt like that. It felt very lopsided in the Dwarfs' favor, is now barely in their favor. I'd say this is a 5.5 to 4.5 Dwarf favored matchup. Generally, there will be more wins on the Dwarf side of things, especially when you get lower on the end of skill. And I think that's important for players to realize, is that there's a massive difference, of course, between high-level competitive and just starting out in multiplayer. And generally speaking, the Dwarfs tend to favor newer players. If you're just starting out, the Dwarfs are a top-tier faction. They are fantastic against most other races in the game, simply because they are easy to micro, that most of your game plan starts in pre-battle screen, and if you're able to get a great formation set up and a good army composition, you should be able to handle the majority of threats that are thrown your way. As you go up in skill, the Dwarfs tend to slide down in how powerful they are, but this is still a scenario where good army comp, being ready for your opponent and what they can bring to the battlefield, Dwarfs still have a slight advantage. I would say it's 5.5 to 4.5. So what was a S tier matchup for the Dwarfs is now more like a high C or low B tier matchup for them. Wood Elves have plenty of options. They can definitely win against the Dawi, and their win percentage has shot up since the twist in the Twilight here. Now, it's been very interesting to see how the meta has shifted away from organ guns. Previously, if you brought 2 of them, a lot of shielded troops, a lot of quarrelers, a lot of rangers, and just sat back and blew stuff up, you would wreck face. I mean, organ guns destroy War Dancers, they destroy Way Watchers, they destroy Glade Guard, they mess up Wildwood Rangers. Pretty much every unit on the Wood Elves roster is countered by organ guns, but you're not seeing them as much anymore because the Sisters of Twilight are such a threat in the sky with their Eagle Quiver and their single-shot armor sundering. They blow up cannons very easily, and they can afford to sit there and trade. And it's also a problem because double organ gun is very susceptible to full-on rush builds from the Wood Elves, which previously they were not able to do. If you go double organ gun, you're now leaving yourself open to rush builds because you just don't have a wide army. It's the fact that you had an 18 stack with that organ gun before. You can't really afford to do that because rush builds will just be in your face instantly. They won't have time to generate the value they'd be able to do against kite builds with full-on Way Watchers and Glade Guard spam. So that's been interesting. Bugman's Rangers, definitely an MVP in this matchup. Regen, charge defense against large, shields, they're great. They are fantastic for trading into Wood Elf skirmishers. They are exactly the type of unit you want to make up a decent chunk of your army. I think you don't want to leave home without them. Longbeards are also a very good choice in this matchup, and one of the things we discovered during the course of our games was that Dwarf Warriors really maybe aren't so worth it. Longbeards are interesting in that they are not prohibitively expensive. They will lose to War Dancers in a straight-up fight, but it'll be a slow one for the War Dancers. In fact, the Longbeards are good enough, they'll actually kind of trade upwards into them and leave those War Dancers feeling very sad by the end of it. So if you bring 5 of those, you've got immune to psych front line that's very tanky, that's stupid for players to shoot at, really. And if you've got that core alongside 4 or 5 blasting charges and a whole bunch of Bugman's Rangers and Quarrelers and other types of Rangers, well, you've got all the firepower you need and all the staying power you need to allow yourself to shoot and trade well into an Azrai rush build. And we saw Felkon and Eumaies both manage to pull that one off. Now, one thing that I think will surprise a lot of people is how damn good the ROR Lost Sylvan Knights are here, but there are counters. That is important to remember. The Dwarfs don't have a lot of ways to kill them easily, but they can negate their damage, and one of the best ways to do so is with that Rune Lord with his Locus of Power atop his toilet seat. He hard counters Lost Sylvan Knights. 40% magic damage negation map-wide makes them pretty much unusable. They barely do any damage, and then when they do come in, Master Rune of Wrath and Ruin slows them down. You will be able to chunk them down over time eventually. But if you don't have a Rune Lord with Locus of Power, the Lost Sylvan Knights are a massive threat to the Dawi army because they open up so many opportunities for their other units to do what they need to do. I would say the easiest way for the Wood Elves to win now is with a full-on melee rush. They can still kite. The Dwarfs have to respect their potential for kiting. They still have to respect the Waywatcher and Waystalker spam with Sisters overhead. But I think that melee rushes are easier for the Wood Elves to pull off. And with the Drycha, Rouse to Wrath, Dryad summons, all that good stuff, they can be a serious problem. I think we might see some Ironbreaker cores get thrown in there to spice things up and keep a Wood Elves player honest. So, again, recap, it's now a 5.5 to 4.5 matchup, slightly Dawi favored. Very interesting stuff. Hope you guys enjoyed this look at the Wood Elves versus Dwarfs matchup. And if you want to see this kind of content again in the future, please let me know. I will see you all in the next video. I want to thank Felkon and Eumaies for showing up and playing a bunch of games with me and discussing our findings. And I will see you all next time. Any Pride, signing out for now.